you, Rose, and today we're going to be talking about a paper called How Does Anyone Leave Plato's Cave? And I've been on a bit of a Plato kick here from the discussion on art and philosophy with Voicecraft, Tim Adlin, inspired by Johannes's recording and reading of Plato's Cave, where it really struck me when he said the line, bound to think. And I was talking, and I also, this paper on the blank canvas, but I was talking with the wonderful Thomas Jockin. You know, it was funny because we were talking about Plato's cave, and the question came up, you know, it was kind of like, wait a minute, how exactly do people get out of the cave? And it was kind of funny because I admittedly was stumbling around. I was going, well, I think there's a hypothetical example where they're forced out, but there's other examples where they're just mysteriously released. And after the conversation, you know, I was kind of like, I need to go check on that. So I went to the book. And what was really crazy is that rather than the situation where he's dragged out being hypothetical, it turns out that was the reason he escaped the cave. And I was just kind of curious. I was like, why in the world have I remembered Plato's cave as being more so the case that the prisoner on his own frees himself? Sure, maybe he gets some instruction from an educator, from some mysterious person who shows up. But ultimately, I had been under the impression, or just was remembering, that there was a version of the story where he leaves on his own, and I found this really curious. So then I got exploring different translations of the allegory of the cave. Now, I think it's probably the case that I've been influenced by the zeitgeist of the society. You know, we think of the movie like The Matrix, which plays certainly on Plato's cave, with the red pill. And certainly Morpheus speaks to Neo, but at the end of the day, Neo freely chooses the red pill instead of the blue pill. And I think that's kind of the narrative you see repeating in many different stories in the West, is that leaving the cave is mostly a matter of choice. There might be some instruction, but most of it is a matter of choice. And you know, so I was looking through these different instructions, these different interpretations. The other thing I did is checked out some of the videos on YouTube, you know, because YouTube is a great source of education. And I have to give Orson Welles credit. I've always liked Orson Welles. I think his video clearly shows that the prisoner is forced out, that he's dragged by the hand out. Whereas other versions, say the one on TED Talk or some of the other things you find, the detail of being brought outside is mentioned, but it's not animated, so you don't see the prisoner being forced out. He just appears outside. And also the language could be interpreted as brought himself out, or when it says one prisoner is freed and brought outside for the first time. Well, it's not clear if the prisoner freed himself or herself and brought themselves outside. It's not clear, so it's quite vague. What I found really interesting is, again, I went to these three translations of the Republic, one by Gruber, I believe is how you say it, Joette, and the Alan Bloom of Closing the American Mind. And I'm not meaning to say these are the best translations or something. I just think that looking at these three can help us understand why there's this blurred interpretation in our heads of the allegory, where there's versions he's dragged and versions where he escapes on his own. And what was very interesting is that in all of them, there's evidence that the prisoner is dragged out by force. The prisoner is not some individual who achieves enlightenment on his own and then frees himself and leaves. No, he basically doesn't want to leave. He resists leaving and he's forced to go. Or someone comes and tells him that everything around him is fake. He doesn't realize it on his own. So I want to call it, there's this free interpretation, I'm going to call it the FI, this free interpretation of the allegory, where the prisoner leaves on his own. But really, it's more like the dragged interpretation, or what I'm going to call the DI. So the question is the following: why is the FI so prevalent? Why is it so easy to forget the detail that the prisoner is dragged out? Well, of course, obviously, there's more space for the ego if we think of ourselves as the enlightened one who leaves the cave, which all of us tend to think. So we want to forget the detail of being dragged. We want to think it's our own self-doing. And also, if all of the depictions in media and Hollywood and so on and so forth is of a character choosing the red pill per se, then it's easy to forget that detail. But you know, when you look at these three translations, the wording of it can lead one to concluding that when Plato talks about being dragged out into the sun, it can actually sound like a hypothetical situation where the prisoner is dragged out, but at the same time, what actually happens is the prisoner walks out. So that's what I found interesting looking at these different translations. It really depends on the wording to impact the impression. So, for example, the allegory is located at the start of chapter 7, book 7. And with the Gruber translation, it opens with next, I said, compare the effects of education and the lack of it on our nature into an experience like this. Imagine human beings, so on and so forth. So it's like compare the effects of education. Well, that language, the effects of education, kind of sounds like schooling and instruction. This to go to school is to be someone brought out of a cave. Okay, well, that sounds like a communal act, not just an individual act. But now let's look at this Joet interpretation, which is the Barnes and Noble version of the Republic. And it opens like this. And now I said, let me show in a figure how far our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. Behold, human beings living in an underground den, and so on and so forth. Well, our nature is enlightened or unenlightened. That certainly sounds like individual enlightenment. That doesn't involve any schooling or society. So that interpretation really lends itself in the direction of that translation lends itself in the direction of individual enlightenment. And then we have the Bloom, which says, next then, make an image of our nature in its education and want of education, liking it to a condition of the following kind. See human beings as though they were in the underground cave-like dwelling, and so on and so forth. Well, the Bloom one here is kind of a toss-up, because make an image of our nature in its education and want of education. Well, the word education certainly lends itself in schooling, but the way it is worded here sounds like enlightenment, where the word education and enlightenment go together. So these three, this is the opening line of book 7, and that's going to be your first impression of the allegory. So it's going to frame the rest of it. So it's really important. The wording here, and certainly in the Joet interpretation, it sounds like individual enlightenment. So that's quite important. Now, there are going to be other sentences in the Joet translation that lend themselves in the direction of the DI, the drag interpretation versus the FI. But this is the initial framing. So that's going to impact us in big ways. All right, well, let's move to the first image of a released prisoner, and this will be the Grube translation, all right? When one of them was freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his head, walk, and look up toward the light, he'd be pained and dazzled and unable to see the things whose shadows he'd seen before. What do you think he'd say if we told him that what he'd seen before was inconsequential, and so on and so forth? Well, none of that. So the phrase, when one of them was freed and suddenly compelled, it doesn't say that someone freed them or that someone forced them to turn their head, to stand up and turn their head. Freed, was free. That could mean we free ourselves, and compelled could be motivated. And then the key here is this word we. What do you think he'd say if we told him? So that sounds like Plato, or I guess this would be Socrates and who he's speaking with. It sounds like a hypothetical. If we told him, so if we were there in the cave to tell him that what he'd seen before was inconsequential, how would he respond? Well, the impression of this translation is that there's no one in the cave telling the prisoner that it's all inconsequential. And basically that leads us as a reader to conclude that the prisoner figures it out for himself. So that translation really lends itself in the direction of the FI, the autonomous individual. All right, well, this will be the Joet interpretation, the Barnes & Noble one. At first, when any of them is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck round and walk and look toward the light, he will suffer sharp pains. The glare will distress him, and he will be unable to see the realities of which in his former state he had seen the shadows, and then conceive someone saying to him that what he saw before was an illusion. Well, everything I just said about the Grube translation applies here. This is very autonomous sounding. When any of them is liberated, well, that could just mean an individual achieves enlightenment on their own, and then they are motivated, compelled to stand up and turn his neck around. So this is all very autonomous. You don't really have a clear image of someone releasing the prisoner, coming down and releasing the individual. And then with the phrase, and then conceive one saying to him, well, that just sounds like a hypothetical. It doesn't sound like there's actually someone there saying to him. Now, I want to stress, back in the original language, the original of the Republic, all this must be far clearer. But we're trying to figure out why the FI interpretation of the allegory has emerged versus the DI, and that's going to bring us to these English translations. And so anyway, going on to the Bloom, the Alan Bloom interpretation of this same section, we say, take a man who is released and suddenly compelled to stand up, to turn his neck around, to walk and look up toward the light, and who, moreover, in doing all this in pain, and because he is dazzled, is unable to make out those things whose shadows he saw before. What do you suppose he'd say if someone were to tell him that before he saw silly nothings? This language, I think, does lend itself better in the direction of there being, say, a teacher or a guard who releases the prisoner, because it says, take a man who is released. The phrase who is released sounds like someone does the releasing, and suddenly compelled. Well, we understand compelled then in the context of the phrase who is released, so it can sound like the guard or the teacher releases the prisoner and then compels or tells the prisoner or even forces his head in the direction of the light. And then if we take the word in the final sentence of if someone were to tell him, well, we assume that someone is whoever released the prisoner. So the Bloom interpretation here lends itself better in the direction of the DI versus the FI. But do you see how it's all blurring together, how it's not clear, and how based on where we hear the allegory, or maybe we hear the Bloom interpretation early in life and the Duet later in life, then it can all start to mix together. And that's where you can get this idea of the FI interpretation of the cave. Now, it's described later in the paper. I'm not against the FI interpretation, because ultimately I think the allegory of the cave has to lend itself into a first prisoner problem, kind of like the first mover problem. Like if there's some people who come down into the cave and release prisoners, well, who released them? And the way I frame this question is, how did Plato escape the cave? How did Plato escape the cave? So you do have a first mover problem, or you at least have the potential problem of the prisoner for whom no one came. How does that prisoner escape? Can that prisoner escape? Plato might suggest they cannot, that some external instructor is necessary. But it's a fair thought experiment, so I don't mean to be suggesting in this paper that freedom interpretation is completely crazy. So again, we go through all these interpretations, and I would encourage you to see the paper and go through each of the three translations in all the different ways and see how confusing it is and how determined one's impression of the allegory is by the particular translation. But I also want to make the point that Plato himself contributes to the confusion about FI versus DI, for he seems to be playing both sides of the fence. So after the allegory, there's this part where he's describing, what the parable meant and so on and so forth. He says things like, the visible realm should be likened to the prison dwelling, and the light of the fire incited to the power of the sun. And if you interpret the upward journey and the study of things above as the upward journey of the soul to the intelligible realm. So that's from the Grube translation. The Joet is going to talk about the ascent of the soul, and the Bloom edition is going to talk about the soul's journey up. Wait a minute, hold on. There was no journey or ascent or going up in the allegory. The prisoner was dragged. You see, this is the thing. Plato later on is talking about the ascent of the soul, but there wasn't really do we consider dragging an ascent? I mean, in a way it could, but ascent sounds so autonomous, so holy, so clean. Whereas the allegory was a dragging of the prisoner, a forcing of the prisoner up. So that language absolutely is in favor of the FI. So this is confusing. So this might begin to explain why the possibilities of how the prisoner escaped becomes confused. And then if we exist in the West, in the middle of that confusion, we're naturally going to favor the FI over the DI, the freedom interpretation versus the dragged interpretation. And then, Plato, one may counter that since later on Plato says something like, it is our task as founders then to compel the best natures to reach the study we said before is the most important, namely to make the ascent and see the good. We mustn't allow them. Joet says they must be made to descend again. Bloom talks about how the founders compel and not permit them. Well, this is a language of there being other people who are going to force the philosophers back down into the cave. So someone may counter and say, well, look, Dan, there's a lot of DI-sounding language here when Plato is talking about making the philosopher kings come back. Well, I would just argue that what this means is that the prisoners on their own escape the cave, and then they're forced to go back down in. We don't tend to remember it as them being forced, that they are forced out of the cave and back into the cave. We tend to think of them as simply forced back into the cave, but not being forced out of the cave. Yes, there is language of Plato talking about the prisoners as our pupils, but that gets interpreted into the context of forcing them back into the cave. Also, we can have this idea of, again, this kind of blending a little bit more in the middle between the DI and the FI, where maybe a teacher comes down into the cave, teaches the prisoner, but then the prisoner on their own internalizes that education and escapes. So that's where you can have this idea that the allegory is about education, but that education is in service of intrinsic motivation. And that's a valid take for everyday life, but it's really critical to understand that that's not really located in the allegory. That's something we read into it. And I also want to stress that if you have this idea of the prisoner choosing to leave the cave and then being forced back into the cave, that sounds very much like Jesus. And in the West, we tend to think of things in terms of Christianity. So that might be another reason we go in the direction of FI and DI. And frankly, that interpretation of choosing to come out on their own and then being forced back in really sets up the prisoner to be a martyr. And if we see ourselves as the prisoner in that context, and we become Christ-like and a sort of martyr, and that actually then leads itself in the direction of building up the ego. So that's a problem. When really, following Plato, they're forced out and forced back in. And it's precisely because it's thanks to Plato and Socrates and the founders or whoever that people leave the cave. That's why they're justified, and it's not immoral to put them back into the cave, because they wouldn't have even left it without the founders. So, for Plato, they're forced out and forced back in. So that all said, I think the evidence is in favor of the allegory of the cave to Plato being far more DI than FI. But there is a first mover problem here that I think justifies considering the thought experiment of a prisoner leaving the cave on their own without any help. Because how did Plato get out of the cave? If someone comes down and releases prisoners, well, who released them, and so on and so forth. Perhaps you can say everyone was born on the surface, but then someone was forced to birth children underground, and so on and so forth, and that's why there were people on the surface. But that sounds very much like Eden. There was a paradise, and then people fell, and then God, by his grace, has to save them, and certainly that could be the case. That would, in a way, solve the first prisoner problem, but we still have the prisoner nobody comes for. What about because the Eden story would explain how there are people in the upper world that come down into the prison cell. But what about a prisoner who nobody knows is there? How does that person get out, seeing as nobody comes? I think this is a really, really important question that actually Plato leaves open and will be a major concern of the work of O.G. Rose, especially moving into the fate of beauty and cultivating aesthetic sensibilities. That last one's a tentative title, but something like that, which is really going to get into the question of where does intrinsic motivation come from? And can it be taught? Can we give it to ourselves? All of these really major questions. It would seem that we are starting to realize that intrinsic motivation is very important. You almost have a Hegelian moment where consciousness is realizing it needs intrinsic motivation, but that's an entirely different subject. Because the only way, if no one can come for the prisoner, then the only way the prisoner gets out is to somehow, on their own, will to get out, to be intrinsically motivated to get out on their own. How is that even possible? I think it has something to do with beauty. I think it has something to do with aesthetics and cultivating the ability to see those things. But all of that is an extremely expansive topic. If it is the case that the prison chains, the chains are too strong for anyone to break, well, then intrinsic motivation is not possible or will not be an answer, but that would be the end of the discussion. So we have to consider the possibility of intrinsic motivation and to take that very, very seriously. And so this paper will be the beginning, kind of the opening of that conversation. For more, please see ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.